You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Richard Lim is joining me on the podcast today. Richard is the CEO of Retail Economics, an independent economics consultancy. He has a wealth of experience in data analytics, consumer research, and macroeconomics. Richard previously headed up the insight and analytics team at the BRC and also worked in M&A for Citigroup. Richard always has his finger on the pulse, and if you follow him on LinkedIn, you'll have seen his weekly posts showing all the things that are happening in retail for the week ahead. And I have to say, I've definitely gotten an idea or two for the podcast on the back of those posts. So firstly, thank you, Richard, for that. And secondly, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
Now, a lot of our listeners will already know you or will have heard you on TV or radio, but can you share a few words about yourself and Retail Economics?
Sure, thanks. So I'm Richard Lim. I'm CEO of Retail Economics. Retail Economics is an independent economics consultancy. So we focus primarily on consumer and retail, and we like to put economic analysis, econometric modelling, forecasting, behavioural economics at the heart of the insight that we offer our clients and the industry.
Great. And so we're going to kick off with the economy. We're going to kick off with inflation. Just to get your thoughts on inflation, Richard. Now, this seems to be moving in the right direction, but we have to call out that shop prices are still rising, right? They're not declining. They're just rising at a slower pace. We're certainly not in a deflationary environment, right? And there are a lot of other factors, of course, that will impact consumer sentiment, consumer confidence. But I'd love to get your take on the health of the consumer right now. How do you think the average consumer is feeling?
I think it's still, conditions are still tough out there. And so, as you've rightly said, inflation, although it's down on a steep downward trajectory, it's still at elevated levels. And it's still a bit of a war of attrition when it comes to inflation, because we've just been through a period of consecutive months of eroding incomes. And so that's only changed recently. But even if you look at the Bank of England's latest forecast, then we still might see earnings growth dip under inflation as we head into the tail end of this year and heading into next year. So it might not be over yet, but we're certainly past the worst of it. But I also think it's good to add some context to this as well, because it was only this time last year, if you remember, that we'd just come out of a Truss government. And so, we had a mini budget, and so financial markets were in turmoil. Inflation was peaked at 11.1%, and consumer confidence was actually at an all-time low. Only this time last year, so lower than the depths of the financial crisis and the pandemic, and also at that time the Bank of England were projecting a 2-year deep and protracted recession. So that was this time last year, and so we've definitely kind of transitioned through the last 12 months better than many of us had expected, and consumers have been much more resilient than many had expected. So although things are quite tough, definitely a lot better than where we were looking this time last year into 2023.
Yeah, and I think resilience is a word that comes up time and time again. I think we've all been surprised at how resilient consumers have been given everything that's been thrown at them. Now, I heard you on the radio a few weeks ago, and you were talking about the cost of living crisis and how lower income households have been disproportionately impacted. And of course, it's the lower income consumers who spend a larger proportion of their income on essentials like food. And then that disparity, at least for a while, was exacerbated by the fact that many more affluent consumers had pandemic savings to prop up their spending. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And now with interest rate rises, the picture seems to change kind of fairly considerably, I think, in my view, at least. So my question for you, Richard, is how do you see this impacting spending? Do you think we've seen the effects of this take hold yet? Or might there be more pain to come for consumers in 2024?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer is that there's lots of moving parts, and there is still more pain to come, but that pain is likely to be focused in specific cohorts of households, and particularly those with with mortgages and mortgages that are going to come up for renewal, and even within that renewal mortgage market, there's particular groups, for example, like millennials who, or kind of older millennials who were taking out mortgages over the last 5 years, who were probably more leveraged than other groups, or the data shows that this is a group of consumers that were more leveraged than other groups, have higher debt levels as a proportion of their income, and so as they roll forward to renew mortgages, it's actually this particular group that's going to feel the kind of the tightest squeeze with respect to mortgages and housing costs. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the cost of living crisis, or the narrative around the cost of living crisis has changed from one that was focused predominantly on the least affluent households that spent disproportionately on food, energy, transport, and now this is the narrative has changed as interest rates are beginning to bite and mortgages will continue to renew. So I think we're going to see quite a fragmented view of households and how they're going to
Mm.
react over the next 12 months. But I do also feel it's probably going to be a year of two halves. And so the first half of the year is likely to be more difficult, more challenging, as inflation remains kind of on its downward trajectory, but still high. And then towards the tail end or towards the second half of next year, with all things being equal, it looks like inflation will tail off quite rapidly. The kind of the wording and the narrative out of Bank of England's likely to ease and start talking about a softening of monetary policy as we head towards the second half of the year and into 2025. So that might give households a bit of a boost in confidence, and of course, with confidence comes their willingness to spend. So I think it's generally going to be a bit of a year of two halves next year.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's sparked another thought because so far we've talked about inflation as it impacts the consumer. But I'd really like to get your thoughts on the cost pressures facing retailers. The past couple of years, as we all know, have been challenging for retail with their own costs spiraling out of control at a time when consumer demand was particularly sluggish. It seems like a lot of these cost pressures have now eased or are easing. But as we look ahead to 2024, retailers will still have to contend with things like business rates and minimum wage going up by 10% in April. What's your take on this, Richard?
A lot of the pressures that we saw, for example, in supply chains over the last couple of years have now eased, and so some of those, inflation within the producer price index, which, keeping it simple, the inflation rate faced by retailers has eased considerably over the last 6 to 9 months. And even if you look at PPI, so the producer price index in China, what we see is the costs that are facing retailers. This is global retail that's importing from China. They're actually seeing deflation in China in terms of the cost of goods. So there's lots of benefits still to come through the supply chain in terms of easing cost of input prices. But also we've seen container costs that went from $2,000 a barrel, 2,000 pounds per container, dollars per container, go up to 14,000, back to where they were pre-pandemic. So there's lots of easing pressures in terms of supply chains. But I still think that in the UK particularly, operating costs will still remain challenging, and so we still got labour costs that remain a significant issue. Business rates remains a significant burden for the industry. We still got utility costs are higher than where they were. Logistics costs are still higher. So all of these wave of rising operating costs are coming through and really squeezing margins. And actually, we did a piece of work looking at the top 150 retailers across the UK, looking at pre-tax profit margins. And what we've seen is roughly pre-tax profit margins halve in the last decade. They've gone from about 8.5% to about 4.5% over the last decade. So there's a real squeeze on profitability for retailers, and as you've said, that's against a much softer outlook for consumer demand as well.
Yeah, and I guess at a time too when retailers are under a lot of pressure to continue investing in price for the consumer. So there's that challenge as well, which I imagine would further erode their margins. Um,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, great, Richard. So that's I'm not going to ask you any more about inflation. I think we've covered we've covered that in great detail. So thank you for that. I want to switch
Actually,
gears.
Natalie, let me. Sorry to
Go
interrupt.
ahead.
Because
No, not at
I've
all.
got
Go for it.
I've got a slight theory about inflation as well, which
Ooh, share it.
which I think so. Consumer spending has been more resilient than many had expected, and so and as we've seen inflation rise to 11.1%, and it peaked out and it's gone down. And so, but consumers, I think what's important to recognise is that consumers are much savvier than they were. But if we look back at the last recession during the financial crisis, and actually competition in the industry is much more intense. There's lots more choice. There's lots more ability for for consumers to trade up and down the value range. And so, actually, I think part of the solution that consumers have adopted in terms of controlling the amount of pressure their personal finances have been under is, of course, trading down, trading to private labels, switching to cheaper supermarkets and brands. And that change in behavior is not necessarily picked up by the official inflation data when you're just looking at inflation, CPI inflation versus wage growth. And so in many ways, those kinds of changes in behavior has led to a situation where consumers are just managing their own levels of inflation. And actually, so I'd say in some instances, the inflation rate's probably overstated the squeeze on personal finances because it can't take into account that ability for consumers to trade up and down the value range that they're so well adept to do these days.
Yeah, that's really interesting how consumers, I think we've all had to navigate inflation in our own ways. And again, up until recently, we did have some COVID savings to maybe rely on and help us through that. But yeah, really interesting stuff. Thank you, Richard. Okay, let's move on to retail sales data. We've had some interesting figures out this morning from both the BRC and Barclaycard. And Richard, I appreciate I'm totally springing this on you, and you probably haven't had a chance to look at the numbers. You definitely haven't had a chance to digest them. So we're going to run through some of the what I think are interesting findings of both of those releases. And then I'd love to get your initial take. So both the BRC and Barclaycard data, I appreciate they are, you can't compare like for like here, but they are painting a similar picture, but taking a very different tone, very different interpretation of the data. The BRC says cautious consumers are delaying Christmas spending. Total UK retail sales were up 2.7% in November. Now that's above the 3-month average of 2.6%, but below the 12-month average of 4.1%. CEO Helen Dickinson, who I'm told is coming on the podcast next month, so hopefully I'll have the opportunity to pose these questions directly to Helen. But Helen said that Black Friday initially had the desired effect, but the momentum failed to hold throughout the month. So I thought that was interesting. Spent a lot of time talking about Black Friday on this podcast. Now, Barclaycard data is really interesting. They said that consumer card spending grew by a similar amount, by 2.9% year on year in November. They said that consumer confidence in the ability to spend on non-essential items was at its highest level since April. And that makes sense because people have generally been reining in their discretionary purchases. But if the whole high street is on sale, then yeah, you might feel a little bit more confident to spend. Barclaycard also called out the fact that restaurants fell further into decline during the month of November. Over a third of consumers said that the cold weather and dark evenings have had an impact on their spending patterns. And this has resulted in a boost for what they refer to as Insperiences, or at-home experiences. They said that spending on takeaways was up 6%. Spending on digital content and subscriptions was also up by about 6%. The final season of The Crown has helped with that. Consumers are staying home, they're binging on TV. I've been watching a lot of The Crown, but also a lot of Virgin River as well. I'm not ashamed to admit. But we're staying home. We're not going out as much, and the restaurants are feeling it. The other final thing I'd like to call out here is what Barclaycard refers to as revenge spending, which they say has boosted the travel sector again. The travel sector has recorded double-digit growth for 11 of the past 12 months. And looking to 2024, a fifth of consumers that they surveyed said that they're planning more holidays next year to catch up on trips that they missed during lockdown. So lots of interesting things. I've thrown so much at you, Richard. I'd love to get your initial take and hear what you think of all of this.
I think the first thing to mention is that there's a huge polarization between values and volumes. And so if you look at the value data, yes, it kind of suggests that people are spending more, and that is the case. And we've seen consistent growth in values over the last year, right throughout the cost of living crisis. But of course, all of that growth in values is being driven by inflation. And if you look at the ONS data and you look at, because BRC just focus on value data, but if you look at the ONS volumes data, then what we've seen is a consistent decline in the amount of stuff that consumers are buying for. It's around about 18 to 20 months now. So for 18 to 20 consecutive months, year-on-year comparisons show that people are buying less, and that's essentially the impact of trading down and cancelling some products and just decreasing the frequency of some purchases as well. So so there's lots of moving parts around the different timings and seasonal comparisons and things like that. So lots of different things to take account of. But I like the expression of the kind of the inexperience and presumably making the most of Netflix subscriptions and Sky and watching things at home as the nights have drawn in and they've got colder. So probably not surprising given this is the kind of usual behaviour that we'd see most years.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a time of year where we kind of, cocoon and stay home, and maybe we're inspired to even more because of, the pressures on our wallets. And so entertaining at home. And in fact, I was at a major high street retailer which hosted an
Yeah.
event last week. Can't say any more than that. But a couple of interesting things they said. Well, firstly, they just signed off on Christmas 2024. So just so fascinating to see how much planning goes into that. They start their planning in August and they sign off early December for the next year. I mean, I just can't imagine how hard of a job that must be. But also they said that party food was being brought out earlier in the month this year because they're expecting more people to entertain at home instead of, so going out to the pub and a restaurant or wherever. So I thought that was interesting too. I think retailers, especially the supermarkets, are really expecting expecting consumers to celebrate and maybe do more of that at home than they have done in the past. So.
Yeah, I mean, like, all of the research that we've done in lead up to Christmas actually shows that people are still looking to be very cautious. Cautious in terms of spending, looking to try to make their budget stretch as far as possible, looking to pull forward their spending, their Christmas spending into October, November, taking advantage of Black Friday to do a lot of their shopping there. And so, in terms of the distribution of festive sales in the run up to Christmas, it has completely changed over the last 5 years. But this year compared to last year, the distribution of sales looks very similar. And so we've got a kind of a huge peak in November around Black Friday where people are taking advantage of the discounts and some of that Christmas spends creeping into that. And then a kind of a smaller hump in terms of non-food as we get nearer to Christmas. But it seems though as though people have brought forward some of their spending into October, just to really spread out as much as they can and spread out the spending as much as they can and be a bit more planned and tactical around their Christmas spending. And so some of that pulled forward spending is likely to come of the detriment of sales in November as well, potentially.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the final days before Christmas. It does feel like a lot of sales are being concentrated around, around these big events like Black Friday and Cyber Monday. But of course, as I've talked about a lot on the podcast recently, it's Black November, right? I mean, John Lewis
Yeah,
started on the 4th of
absolutely.
November. So as you say, consumers I think are looking to spread the cost and bring those purchases a little bit earlier. But at the same time, I feel there's going to be a last minute rush. And that's what we're hearing from some US retailers as well. I know Best Buy's in the US has said similar that they're expecting, a big sales push in the final days. And again, there's always that game of chicken, right? Where consumers think, oh,
Yeah,
are there going to be more discounts? I'm going to hold out. And um,
yeah,
yeah, and it
exactly.
just feels like it's come around really quickly this year. So I don't know if that's just me and life being busy, but there we go. So just to switch gears a little bit, let's talk about digital transformation. And I don't like to dwell on the pandemic. I think, we kind of acknowledge the effects of the pandemic. But I think if we go back to the dark COVID times for a minute, we have to acknowledge that it was a huge catalyst for digital transformation. And I think as consumers, we've definitely benefited from that. I think we've kind of taken retailers' digital transformation efforts for granted because very quickly things become the norm. And before you know it, we're expecting something even better and even more frictionless and even more, convenient and easy. So it's tough for retailers to keep up. And something this phrase I keep coming back to is that perpetual disruption requires perpetual innovation because retail is always evolving, right? It's this living
Yeah.
thing. So with that in mind, Richard, I wonder how you would assess retailers' efforts to digitize their businesses. Have they done enough? And where might there be room for improvement as we look to the future?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, a really interesting topic because I think from the work that we do for some of our clients and also how we, the conversations that we're having within the industry, I think what's really clear is that it's a really uneven landscape when it comes to digital capabilities. And so you've got some retailers on one end of the scale that are best in class, trying to integrate best in class technology with the best partners, and some of that's around some of the new technology around Gen AI and trying to use that for better demand forecasting and personalization and things. But then you've got retailers on the other end of the scale where they're still grappling with data, still grappling with not having enough data about their customers. They don't have loyalty schemes necessarily, and so they're still kind of feeling around in the dark when it comes to how best to push forward their digitization efforts. And so, so we see this kind of really uneven landscape across the sector. And actually, I think that we've got to a point where we're seeing a gulf emerge between those retailers that are really have really invested in their digital transformation over the last few years. They continue to embrace innovation, creativity, and disruption. And so there's this gulf opening up between those that have that kind of sophistication in digital and those that don't. And I can only see that growing as we're kind of on this really steep curve of technological progression. So kind of really uneven picture.
Yeah. Yeah, that is really interesting. And I mean, it almost feels like in this day and age, you just can't afford you can't afford to be complacent. You can't afford not to invest in technology and digital transformation. But still, as you say, there are some retailers out there that are still kind of, failing to keep up, failing to invest. So I think,
Well, it's just a huge challenge, So if you look at some of the consecutive waves of disruption, whether that's from the pandemic, whether that's from the cost of living crisis, margins being squeezed. And so, understandably, there's a lot of retailers that have been sitting there and just being completely focused on protecting profitability at the expense of investing in their business. And so there's, and so for those retailers that don't, feel like they have little choice other than to kind of batten down the hatches, cut costs, focus on profitability. For some of them, the reality is there's just little room for investment when it comes to digital. But eventually, that's going to be to the detriment of the business in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is I've definitely been hearing more retailers looking to technology, not just to enhance the customer experience, of course, but also to reduce their own cost base. And obviously, there's a lot of technology out there, a lot of, around automation that will help retailers with addressing this. But there's always a huge initial outlay with any kind of tech investment. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, absolutely. I think there is this gulf emerging, as you so eloquently put it.
Yeah, well, I think that the other thing for me as well is that digital transformation is actually bringing about different business models as well. It's allowing retailers to do things that they couldn't do even just a few years ago because of, as you said, the kind of the better efficiency, the use of data, more sophisticated use of data, and how that's changed the ability for retailers to embrace different business models. So when you were talking, it reminded me of ASOS that just a couple of weeks ago was talking about their test and react model, and so they're kind of they're trying to become faster and nimbler, and trying to get from design to site within 2 weeks, and then using kind of 500 lines to test the demand before they go into kind of full on production of particular SKUs. So,
Mm.
using really small runs, testing, reacting to the model, and within a couple of weeks being able to kind of put that onto their website. So that test and react model counts for 1% of sales today. They want to grow that to 10% of their sales in the future.
Oh, wow.
And it's yeah, and it's kind of it's speaking the same language as Shein as
I was
well.
gonna say that sounds very Shein.
Yeah, well, so I was kind of well, I was with them quite recently. It's kind of like no secrets here, but they were saying to me that they were testing up to 5,000 lines per day. And some of those lines
Wow.
were kind of like 200 garments at a time, but testing up to 5,000 a day worldwide. So
Wow.
it's kind of
Just
like
can't get
gives
your head
you an
around
idea of
numbers
the
like that.
scale. Yeah.
Wow. No, that's interesting. And obviously, retailers like Shein and ASOS and all the fast fashion retailers are under a lot of pressure to be more environmentally conscious. And I guess in doing that, I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but I would imagine that using data and being more agile in your approach not only has the potential to deliver a better customer experience, but also there's the potential to reduce your overall carbon impact and
Mhm.
reduce waste and that sort of thing, and really creating things and shipping things around the world that customers really want. So I think that's potentially
Yeah.
another interesting
I
aspect of
think
all that.
it feeds into the efficiency point, and so digital transformation, is in many instances just a drive towards better efficiency, better productivity, trying to improve profitability as well. And if you look at most businesses and you look at their carbon emissions and their and the carbon footprint, the first thing that all businesses can do is to try to improve efficiency, try to reduce waste. And so, and so technology is definitely a route to try to do that.
Yeah, yeah, because financial sustainability and environmental sustainability, as we know, go hand in hand. So makes perfect sense. Now, Richard, I'm conscious of time. I mean, we could be here for hours, and I guess that's the good thing about podcasts is there is no limit. But I won't keep you too much longer. I do want to touch on something you mentioned previously, which was generative AI.
Mm.
And as we all know, AI and specifically Gen AI is just everywhere at the moment. So, can you talk us through how you see AI being deployed in the industry? What are the opportunities for retailers in this space?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, obviously, it's the buzzword, and actually, talking about this is kind of timely because it was only about a year ago that ChatGPT was actually launched. So it's been a kind of a year that ChatGPT has been with us, and there's been this explosion of different technologies around Gen AI, and a lot of that is tapping into Chat GPT as well. And I got asked the other day, actually, it's kind of the question was, is Gen AI the new metaverse? Is it just a kind of
Oh.
flash in the pan? Are we going to be talking about something else, this time next year? I think the answer to that well, in my view, the answer to that is no. And I think that the big thing here is that Gen AI is solving genuine pain points for retailers. And so retailers are looking at the technology, looking at how they can apply the technology throughout their business. And this isn't just about personalization. This is about applying Gen AI throughout the whole of the retail value chain, right from kind of design and concept to sourcing and route optimization through to personalization, but then right to the end when they're using Gen AI for chatbots and things like that. But some of the key things, though, that I think is where it's really going to touch retail and really change what retailers do and how they embrace the technology is certainly around better demand forecasting, better inventory management. Fraud detection is another area as well. Personalization, of course, but also just using the data to be able to, or using Gen AI to have a more sophisticated use of data. And I was talking to one of our clients quite recently, and the way that they were describing how they were using Gen AI within their business was I mean, it was just so impressive. And the kind of the 30-second summary of this conversation is that they're using hundreds of different data points for their customers around some of this around different characteristics, whether that's age or affluence or previous purchase history or information they might have on kind of like wealth or region. So there's hundreds of different attributes that they're using to be able to serve them the best next action. So if a consumer's bought a pair of black jeans, then using data and the pool of 20 or so million customers that they have, they will determine whether the best next action is to serve them some kind of ad for a white t-shirt because they previously bought a black pair of shoes, not a blue t-shirt, a white t-shirt. And then it's about serving them the right ad on the right platform at the right time of the right day of the week. Is it text? Is it mobile? To push them towards a particular SKU that has the best propensity for them to spend. So it's kind of like this sophisticated use of data, I think, is a really fascinating area using Gen AI.
Now, the last thing I'd love to get your views on, Richard, is sustainability. I know we've talked a lot about digital and the pressures facing both retailers and consumers, but the ESG agenda is also still going strong, as it should be. And I think it's also a reminder of all the plates that retailers are spinning these days. They need to offer value, they need to be digital, they need to differentiate and stay relevant. They also need to aim for net zero. I mean, there's just so much that retailers are juggling at the moment. So, in terms of sustainability, though, what are you seeing in this space, and where do you see opportunities for retailers to go further?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's kind of again, we can't do a podcast necessarily without talking about sustainability, at least for 5 minutes, because it is, it's not going away, and it's going to be it's going to be something that people are going to be talking about for decades to come. I think it's interesting because I think there's a number of different pressures for retailers in terms of sustainability, and of course some of that's around their transition towards decarbonisation and how they're going to, on their path to net zero, what do they need to do? How quickly are they going to do it? And I think there's different pressures in different parts of the of the sector as well. We did a piece of work, and one of the things that came out was that just as very high level is that there's quite a big difference in terms of net zero targets when it comes to private and public companies. And so public companies are a bit more under the spotlight, and so they have to answer to their investors, and they have to go to their kind of AGMs, and so there's lots of questions around whether or not they have credible plans for decarbonisation, whether they have science-based targets for the reduction of Scope 1, Scope 2, how are they measuring it? So there's just a lot more pressure. And so I think that there is definitely a kind of a split between public and private. And then even within the retail space, if you look at the largest kind of listed retailers in the UK, there's still only about two-thirds of them that actually have a net zero target at all. And so,
Oh,
so
wow.
it's kind of, it shows that we still got, there's still a lot of work to do in this area. And so whether or not retailers are kind of doing the right thing, I think lots of them are, and there's lots of effort there, but we're still in its infancy when it comes to, like, for example, measuring things like carbon emissions within Scope 3. And so, if we can't do that accurately and we can't measure the reduction in carbon emissions, then it becomes quite difficult to measure progress. But there's plenty of retailers though out there that are doing great things in terms of credible plans, who are working towards being kind of carbon neutral. So there's lots of good good cases for that. I think the other side of the coin, though, is around consumers and whether consumers. I think consumers care, but I think I think there's a question around whether or not they're prepared to either pay for more sustainable options or change their behaviour at the expense of convenience. And so and
Because they
so
have to make a sacrifice, right? There has to be some kind of sacrifice, and there's always this disconnect between what people say they wanna do or will do, and then what they actually go and do, so
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that kind of intentions behaviour gap, I think, comes through. If you look at any kind of survey evidence around this, there probably be 90% of consumers are prepared to pay more for sustainable produced products. Just made up that stat, by the way. But there's
I won't quote you on it.
but there's what consumers say they're going to do and what they do in reality are two different things. And I think a really good example of this actually is I was thinking about a product that could be there was kind of like little there was little brand loyalty. It was a kind of homogenous type of product, and actually there's like a lot of awareness around the potential damage that this was doing to the environment. And so the product that I was thinking about is bottled water. And so, most people are aware that bottled water is usually kind of single-use plastic, albeit some of it's recycled, probably only about 50%, but some of it is recycled. But people are aware of single-use plastic, bottled water. You don't have, most water consumption can be done out of a tap, and actually more than 50% of bottled water is for home or work consumption, so it can be easily replaced. But in the UK, we consume 4 billion bottles of water out of single-use plastics.
Wow,
So
still
that's enough to
today?
go. Still today, it's enough to
Wow.
go around the world 10 times. So 4 billion bottles of water every year. We're still buying more bottled water. It's not like we're on a kind of a downward curve of people stopping buying single-use plastic bottled water. We're still buying more bottled water. And then if you think about the people that say they care about the planet the most, it's Gen Zs. And actually, who buys the most bottled water per capita? Gen Zs.
No, no, really? Wow. That's
Yeah.
so
And then you ask,
surprising, though. I mean, I know
and
we
then
just
you
said there's this disconnect, but still, that surprises me.
Well, I think this is the thing. This is why I was so interested in seeing, choosing a product where you could easily be kind of exchanged to something else, and there was high awareness and things like that, just to see, what does the data tell us about consumption of something that we know has kind of externalities when it comes to the environment. And actually, we're still buying more. It's Gen Zs that are buying the most per capita. And then when you ask consumers who's responsible for the reduction of carbon emissions when it comes to bottled water, the answer is it's not me. It's
Yeah.
the government, it's manufacturers, it's retailers, and actually there's only about 16% of consumers that say, yes, the responsibility for carbon emission reduction is actually my responsibility. So I just
Yeah.
think it's kind of an example of how complicated I think it's going to be, to get to our, if we are to achieve our net zero goal by 2050. I'm not sure necessarily it can be left in the hands of consumers or private corporations.
Richard, thank you so much for your time and for sharing such valuable insights with us. To our listeners, if you want to hear more from Richard, you can head over to retaileconomics.co.uk or connect with him on LinkedIn. And I will be including all of those links in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.